My name is Silas Mercer, and last week, I woke up to find my wife Ivory and our daughter Camille gone. I remember the way the morning light slanted across the kitchen tiles, as if the sun itself wanted to bear witness to the mess they left behind. The house was too quiet. No sound of Camille's laughter, no Ivory humming along to her morning playlist. Just the ticking of the old grandfather clock I'd inherited from my father, every tick like a metronome counting down to the realization I didn't want to admit. They were both gone. Along with them, a duffel bag I'd used to stash what was supposed to be our future, $20 million in cash. Or so, I'd let Ivory believe. I'd closed the deal of a lifetime. 10 years of phone calls, legal hurdles, and negotiations, all wrapped up in a single wire transfer that had landed in my account the week before. It was supposed to be the start of a new chapter, the beginning of a life we'd dreamed about since we were 22 and broke, sharing dollar menu burgers and planning for a future neither of us thought we'd actually see. That money was our ticket out of stress, out of constant compromise, out of feeling like every small luxury needed to be justified. I remember the night I withdrew it, hour after hour at the bank, making sure every note was crisp, counting it myself because I trusted no one. I took it home in a locked briefcase, feeling like a high roller in a cheap movie. The plan was simple: keep it safe in Ivory's private safe overnight, then we'd deposit it into our joint account in the morning. It wasn't supposed to be complicated. I thought, stupidly, that after all these years, trust still lived in our home. I thought that maybe, just maybe, the dream hadn't died the way so many other things had. Instead, I got a note. Folded neatly on the kitchen counter, written in her delicate, practiced hand, the same hand that had once penned me love letters on sticky notes. Thanks for your money. Now we can live our dream life. That was it. No explanation. No apology. Not even a goodbye. I stared at it like it was a punchline to a joke I didn't understand. Then, because I couldn't think of anything else to do, I laughed. I laughed until my chest ached and my throat burned. Because that duffel bag she took? It was a decoy. A ruse I'd perfected in my old life. Back when I worked asset security for private clients who'd taught me every dirty trick in the book. See, Ivory never knew the real money was stashed away in a trust only I could access. I'd spent too many years watching other people get burned by the ones they loved, so I'd learned how to protect myself. The $20 million in that bag was nothing but press-printed bond paper, decorative props left over from a deal that had fallen through 2 years ago. I'd planned to donate them to some school play, but Ivory had found them and assumed they were real. I let her believe it. Because deep down, I guess I always knew she'd run. Maybe not this soon, maybe not this way, but at some point, I knew. The trust had been eroding between us for years, every time she canceled a dinner last minute, every time she chose a spa day over a family day. I walked through the house that morning, picking up the pieces of a life that had been built on illusions. Camille's stuffed giraffe lay on the floor of her bedroom, a silent witness to her mother's betrayal. I picked it up, felt the worn fabric between my fingers, and tried to remember the last time I'd seen her smile at me without hesitation. It had been months, maybe longer. Lately, her eyes had been guarded, her laugh forced. I tried to tell myself it was just teenage mood swings, that she was finding herself, that it was normal. But now I knew the truth. She'd known. She'd chosen sides. My wife had given her a story to believe in, one where I was the villain, the controller, the man who'd held them back from their dreams. The garage was empty, too. Her sedan was gone, probably loaded with all the clothes and jewelry she'd bought with my money over the years. The same sedan I'd paid off, insured, and maintained like it was part of the family. I stood there for a long time, staring at the oil stain on the concrete like it was some kind of omen. I remembered the night I'd taught Ivory to drive stick shift in that car, how she'd laughed every time she stalled, how she'd finally mastered it and kissed me like I was the hero of her story. Now, that same car had carried her away from me. I wondered if she'd bothered to buckle Camille in before they fled. I walked back into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of cold coffee from the pot. It tasted bitter, but I drank it anyway. I stared at the note again. Thanks for your money. Now we can live our dream life. My laugh was quieter this time, just a dry chuckle in the back of my throat. Because in that moment, I realized Ivory hadn't just stolen a bag. She'd stolen a piece of herself. The trust she thought she'd outsmarted me with, it had never been real. The real trust had been between us once, but she'd broken it long before she'd packed that bag. I walked to the safe. The combination clicked under my fingers, a rhythm I'd known by heart for years. It swung open to reveal nothing but empty velvet. I half expected to feel something, a surge of anger, a wave of betrayal, a tightness in my chest. But all I felt was a strange kind of relief. Because this was the end of pretending, the end of trying to build a future with a woman who'd already planned her exit. I pulled out my phone and opened my secure financial app. The trust account blinked back at me, numbers steady and unshakable. That was the real money, the real future, the one she'd never see a dime of. I sat back in the chair, the sunlight catching the gold band on my finger. I turned it once, twice, then slipped it off and placed it on the table next to the note. I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need her. I picked up the giraffe and placed it on the kitchen counter, propped up like a sentry. Camille's silent witness to a family that had always been one lie away from falling apart. Then I stood, took a deep breath, and smiled. Because sometimes, the disappearing act is the best show of all. Ivory never knew the real money was stashed in a trust only I could access, an old habit from my days in asset security. It was the kind of detail you learn to guard when you spent years watching greedy clients get devoured by those closest to them. The $20 million in the duffel bag had been nothing but press-printed bond paper, a theatrical prop I'd kept around from a deal that had collapsed 2 years ago. I'd intended to throw it out or maybe donate it to the local community theater. Instead, I'd found a perfect use for it. Funny how life gives you exactly what you need at the most unexpected times. Ivory bought it hook, line, and sinker. I guess a decade of marriage hadn't taught her a thing about me, about the man who never left loose ends, who never let himself be the one to get played. She believed I'd simply left that much cash sitting in a duffel bag overnight. She believed it because she wanted to believe it, because she'd convinced herself she was the hero in some rags-to-riches story, where she'd finally outsmarted the man who had built her entire lifestyle from scratch. I sat in my office that morning, the blinds half drawn to let in just enough light to remind me the world was still turning. The safe was open, the empty velvet interior mocking her ambition. I picked up the duffel bag she'd left behind, a second one, the one with the real cash, still hidden where she'd never find it, and ran my fingers over the faux bills like I was thumbing through a high-stakes game of Monopoly. I couldn't help but smile. I'd spent years reading people, studying the way they moved, the way they lied. Ivory had been no different, though I'd let myself forget that somewhere along the line. Love does that, I suppose. It dulls the edges, makes you believe that the person you hold closest could never be the one holding the knife behind their back. I'd let that feeling fester too long. And now? It was gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat, a reminder that I was still the one in control. I thought back to the months leading up to her little heist, the late nights she claimed were spent at yoga, the girls' nights that always seemed to end with her stumbling in after dawn. I'd wanted to trust her. I'd wanted to believe that we were still on the same team, still building something together. But there'd been too many whispers, too many secret smiles she'd exchanged with strangers at parties, too many receipts I'd found in the laundry that didn't add up. Every lie she told had been a breadcrumb, and I'd followed the trail in my own quiet way, checking bank statements, tracing new accounts that had sprung up like weeds in the cracks of our marriage. She thought she was clever. She thought she was subtle. But subtlety was my specialty. I'd made a career out of protecting the foolish from themselves. And if there was one thing I knew, it was that Ivory had always been the biggest fool of them all. Camille was another story. My daughter. My pride and joy. Or so I'd let myself believe. She'd grown secretive too, hiding behind her phone, always quick to shut it off when I walked into the room. I'd chalked it up to teenage mood swings, but deep down, I'd known there was more. I'd always been good at reading people, and that included my own blood. The way she'd started to side with her mother in every argument, the way she'd rolled her eyes when I tried to talk to her about college or future plans. It all fit too neatly into the puzzle I'd been assembling for months. Camille wasn't just a bystander. She was part of the plot, and that stung more than anything else. Because for a moment, just one, I'd let myself believe she might be different. The night before they left, I'd watched Ivory from the doorway as she packed her girl's weekend bag. She'd been humming a little tune, a smile playing at the corners of her lips like a secret she couldn't wait to share with the world. I'd leaned against the frame, arms crossed, studying every flick of her wrist, every glance she cast toward that safe. She didn't know I'd already switched the real cash for the decoy. She didn't know I'd flagged the bank account she'd been funneling money into, or that every transfer had been documented and neatly tucked away for my lawyer's future amusement. I'd spent too many years letting her believe she was the smart one, the one who'd come out on top. Now, it was my turn to watch the pieces fall. I thought about the way she'd kissed my cheek that night, a quick peck, rehearsed and hollow. "I'll call you from the spa," she'd said. "Don't work too hard." I'd smiled, told her to have a great time, and watched her walk out the door with my duffel bag of fake millions. I let the door close behind her and stood there for a long time, listening to the silence. It was the same silence that filled the house now, a silence that felt more like victory than defeat. I leaned back in my chair and let the memories wash over me, the way Ivory used to call me her rock, the way Camille used to run to me after every scraped knee or bad dream. Those days were gone, replaced by carefully orchestrated betrayal and half-truths that had become the soundtrack of my life. But even as I thought about the years I'd wasted trying to be the man they needed, I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry. Because the truth was, I'd always been one step ahead, always waiting for the moment when they'd show their true colors. And now? Now, I was free. Free from the lies, the manipulation, the constant feeling that I was playing a game I'd already lost. I opened my laptop and pulled up the accounts, every dollar accounted for, every transfer flagged. The trust sat untouched, waiting for the day I'd decide to use it. Ivory and Camille could post all the selfies they wanted, but they'd never see a dime of that money. They'd think they'd won. They'd think they'd finally escaped my so-called control. But they'd never really understood me at all. I didn't build my life on trust. I built it on strategy, on contingencies, on the knowledge that everyone, no matter how close, had a price. Ivory's price had been a dream of a life I'd never promised her. Camille's price? Maybe it was just wanting to feel like she'd finally grown up. Either way, they'd both sold themselves cheap. I closed the safe and let the darkness swallow its contents. I'd let them think they'd pulled off the heist of the century. Let them believe they were living their best lives on some beach in Europe. Let them think I was the fool. Because in the end, the real game had only just begun, and I'd never been one to bet on the losing side. The first call came from Andre, a friend in logistics I'd known since my early days managing high-net-worth asset relocations. He had a knack for making calls sound casual, even when they carried the weight of a bomb. "Silas," he drawled that morning, his voice coated in that easy southern charm. "I thought you might want to know. Your wife's name came up on a private jet manifest." My blood went cold even though I'd expected this, because the devil's in the details. Last-minute booking. Paid in cash. Destination, Spain. Just in case you're still interested. I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Good work, Andre," I said, my voice steady. "Keep me posted on any other movements. You know the drill." He laughed softly. "Always, brother. Some games never change." I hung up and stared at the ceiling for a moment, the drywall smooth and white like a blank page. Spain. Of course she'd pick somewhere with sunshine, somewhere she'd think was a fresh start. But there's no fresh start when you've already burned the bridges behind you. I didn't rush. There was no need. Ivory thought she'd gotten away with the prize money of the century, but all she'd done was steal a decoy and my last shred of faith in her. Let her enjoy her cocktail on a beach for a few days. Let her believe she'd won. I opened the folder on my desk marked Quinlan, Laura Quinlan, international investigator, my former colleague from the days when I wasn't tied to a desk, but to the rhythm of black market transactions and corporate espionage. We'd crossed paths in Morocco on a job that had ended in gunfire and a 4-hour sprint through alleys that smelled like old oil and desperation. She'd saved my ass once, and I'd saved hers twice. That meant she owed me a favor, one I'd been saving for a day like this. I dialed her number and waited, letting each ring stretch the moment. Laura picked up on the third ring, her voice as sharp as ever. "Mercer, you're alive." "Barely," I said, managing a half-smile she couldn't see. "Got a job for you. It's personal." She sighed. "I thought you'd retired from the revenge business." "I did, but sometimes life invites you back in." Silence crackled between us, heavy with shared history. Then she chuckled. "So, you want to ruin them slowly, or are we going full scorched earth?" I leaned back and let the moment settle. "No," I said, surprising myself. "Just make sure the truth hits harder than the theft." "Sounds like your style." I could practically hear her grin through the phone. "Send me what you've got." I reached for the small encrypted drive I'd kept hidden beneath the false bottom of my office drawer, a piece of tech most people didn't even know existed. 6 months of surveillance data, phone calls, bank statements, travel logs, screenshots, voice recordings, everything Ivory and Camille had done to set their little plan in motion. Every time they lied to my face. Every time they'd sold me out. I documented it all, every detail down to the last transfer. I'd learned long ago that revenge wasn't about rage, it was about patience. I'd been patient. I'd waited. Now it was time to let the truth speak for itself. I dropped the drive into a padded envelope, addressed it to Lara's secure drop point in Barcelona, and walked it down to the mailbox at the end of the drive. The sun was setting over the hills, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. I watched the envelope disappear into the slot and felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This was my choice. My move. I wasn't chasing them, not really. I was exposing them to the world, to themselves, to each other. Sometimes the worst punishment wasn't losing everything you'd stolen. It was knowing everyone knew exactly who you were. That was the game I wanted to play. When I got back to the house, I opened my laptop and drafted a message to Lara. Drive is en route. No rush, but thorough. I want every stone turned over. Every lie documented. She replied almost instantly. Consider it done. Enjoy your evening. I smiled and closed the laptop. Enjoy my evening. That was the kind of phrase Ivory used to use. Like every day was a vacation waiting to happen. She never understood that the best evenings weren't always about cocktails and sunset selfies. Sometimes they were about silence. About the small victories no one else could see. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and walked out onto the deck. The air smelled like pine and possibility. Somewhere, miles away, Ivory and Camille were probably sipping something fruity, congratulating themselves on their great escape. I wondered if Camille would remember the times I'd stayed up late helping her with homework, the nights I'd let her crawl into our bed after a nightmare. Would she remember that I'd always shown up, even when her mother hadn't? Or would she just remember the story Ivory had spun, how I was the obstacle in their path to happiness? I took a slow sip and let the burn remind me that pain and pleasure sometimes wore the same face. My phone buzzed, a message from Lara. Just landed in Barcelona. I'll start the dig tomorrow. Anything else you want me to know? I typed back. Yeah, no mercy. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the send button. Then I added, but no gloating either. Just the truth. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about gloating. It wasn't about proving I was smarter, though I'd done that plenty already. It was about something simpler, cleaner. It was about the facts. The cold, hard truth they tried to bury under a pile of fake bills and stolen sunshine. I set the phone down and closed my eyes. The deck creaked beneath me as I leaned back in the chair, though it familiar, solid. I thought about the night Ivory had told me she was pregnant with Camille, how she'd cried tears of joy, how we danced around the living room like idiots, convinced we were building something no one could take from us. I thought about how many times I'd believed her stories, how many times I'd let her talk me into ignoring the obvious. The lies had piled up like bricks in a wall I'd pretended not to see. Now that wall had crumbled, and I was left with the truth. And I could live with that. I took another sip of whiskey and felt the last of the day's sun slip behind the hills. The first stars began to wink in the sky, each one a small, silent witness to the choices we make. I had no illusions about who Ivory had become or who Camille might be now. But I also knew who I was. I was the man who'd taught them both to play the game, and now I was the man who would teach them what happened when you played it badly. I lifted the glass to the stars and let the night hold me. Because in the end, the truth wasn't just a weapon. It was the only thing that could set me free. Meanwhile, Ivory was living out her fantasy, at least on the surface. I watched her every move through the private security network I'd kept running since the day I saw the cracks in her smile. Marbella, an obvious choice. Sun, yachts, beach clubs where the nouveau riche clinked glasses and compared tants. The photos started trickling in on her social media. Beach selfies with carefully arranged towels and branded cocktails, always showing just enough of the ocean behind her to look expensive, always tagging #blessed or #manifesting abundance like a gospel. She posted videos of silk robes hanging from the balcony, their monograms bright white against a background of Mediterranean blue. Camille, my own daughter, tagged her mother in stories about yachts and imported wines. Every post used that same saccharine, manufactured happiness I'd learned to read like a sales pitch. They thought they'd won. That they'd finally escaped my so-called control and could spend the rest of their lives sipping drinks on a sun-drenched deck. But I had eyes on them, real eyes. 2 sets, in fact. Lara had set up a discreet team at the hotel, old colleagues from the private investigation circles, people who could blend into any bar, any spa, any breakfast buffet. They weren't the type to ask questions or show up in mirrored sunglasses. They'd been trained in patience and observation, the same way I'd been. They'd been sending me daily reports, photos of the pool deck where Ivory's laugh carried on the sea breeze, audio snippets of Camille's giggles. I studied them all with the same cold detachment I used to deploy on million-dollar security contracts. They thought they were living the dream. I was counting the seconds until it shattered. The duffel bag of fake bills they'd taken with them, it wasn't just any decoy. Each note had been marked with an invisible UV tag. The tags would only show up under special lights. Lights that happened to be installed in nearly every high-end hotel bar and casino, a little trick I'd picked up during my time building surveillance systems for some of Europe's most paranoid billionaires. The UV tags were harmless, but to anyone who knew what they were looking for, they were as damning as a signature on a confession. It was like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs through a forest of wolves, a path that would lead any curious investigator straight to the truth. Let them think they'd made a clean break. Let them think they'd finally beat the man who'd made a career out of outsmarting people just like them. On day 5, the hotel staff started getting suspicious. The manager, a stickler for detail, had noticed the money when Ivory tried to pay her spa bill in cash, something most tourists never bothered to do. Lara's team had sent me a copy of the CCTV footage. There was Ivory, all confidence and smiles, handing over the crisp notes like she'd just walked out of a bank vault. The cashier's polite smile froze as she scanned the bills and looked up with a practiced, tight-lipped smile that said everything. Within minutes, the hotel security team had flagged the transaction, and I got a message from Lara. "Sir," it read, "they tried to use the bills. Police contacted Interpol. No charges yet, but they're nervous." I read the text 3 times, a grin spreading across my face like a slow sunrise. Let them sweat. This was just the beginning. I leaned back in my chair and let the satisfaction settle in. Ivory had always been good at pretending. She'd played the gracious host at every dinner party, the doting wife at every corporate function, the supportive mother at every recital. But underneath that polished veneer, she was always chasing the next big thing. The next thrill, the next trophy, the next moment of feeling like she'd outsmarted everyone else. She'd married me because she thought I'd be her ticket to a life she could show off to her friends, but she'd underestimated the one thing I'd always been best at, the long game. Camille was easier to read, in a way. She'd always been the golden child, smart, funny, too bright for her own good. I taught her how to read people, how to ask the right questions, how to disappear when you needed to. I never thought she'd use those lessons against me, but that was my mistake. I taught her too well. And now, here she was, tagging her mother in stories about manifesting abundance and trusting the universe. I almost laughed out loud. Trust the universe? The universe didn't give a damn about her hashtags. The universe was busy balancing the books, and the debt she'd racked up with me was about to come due. Lara called me that night, her voice low and amused. "They're rattled," she said. "Hotel security called Interpol, but they can't do anything yet because there's no actual crime on Spanish soil. But they're definitely on their radar. You want me to push them over the edge?" I paused, considering. The old me would have said yes without hesitation, but I wasn't the same man who'd built empires from shadows. I was tired of the games. I just wanted the truth to do its work. "No," I said finally. "Let them hang themselves. I just want them to know that I'm not the fool they thought I was." Lara laughed, low and dry. "Always the patient one," she said. "All right, boss. But they're going to start asking questions. What do you want me to do if they reach out to you?" I thought about that for a moment. The answer was easy. "Nothing," I said. "They already made their choice. Let them live with it." After the call ended, I scrolled through Ivory's posts again. Every caption felt like a slap in the face. "Living my best life. The future is now. Finally free." Free of what exactly? Free of the man who paid for every spa day, every private school, every damn sunset she'd posted with a hashtag blessed? She'd mistaken generosity for weakness, trust for foolishness. And Camille, my own flesh and blood, had bought into the same lie. I wondered if she'd ever think about the times I'd sat through endless dance recitals, the times I'd carried her sleeping to bed after she'd stayed up too late watching movies with me. Probably not. Kids had short memories when it came to loyalty. I closed the app and set the phone down. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I poured myself a drink and let the ice settle in the glass like the pieces of a puzzle I'd been putting together for too long. I thought about the years I'd spent building this life. Every deal, every sacrifice, Every night I'd spent on a red-eye flight chasing money so that they could have everything. And now, they'd thrown it all away for the promise of an easier life. A life without me. I could have chased them. I could have sent lawyers, private investigators, threats. But that wasn't my style. I'd built my life on patience, on strategy, on letting the truth do the heavy lifting. So I sat there, drink in hand, watching the ice melt and the shadows grow long on the walls. I thought about the kind of man I wanted to be, the kind who didn't need to shout to be heard, the kind who let his actions speak louder than his anger. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming something they'd tried to steal from me. Dignity, peace, a future that didn't depend on them. I took a slow sip, let the burn settle in my chest, and smiled. Because they might have thought they'd won. But I knew better. The game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. You'd think betrayal from a wife would be enough to bring a man to his knees, but betrayal from your own daughter? That hits differently. It's like someone reaches inside you and snaps the last thread you didn't even know you were holding on to. Camille had always been my bright spot, the one person I thought I'd built something real with, even if everything else was falling apart. I remembered the nights I stayed up with her through fevers, the way she'd hold my hand crossing the street, that look she used to give me after every dance recital, like I was her hero. That memory made the betrayal sting sharper than any lie Ivory had ever told. It wasn't just the betrayal, though. It was the way she had looked me in the eye a month ago, told me she was applying to grad schools in the States, and needed my help getting her transcripts sorted. I'd gone out of my way to talk to the admissions officers, even paid for her application fees. I'd checked her essays for grammar mistakes. I'd driven her to the airport for interviews, hoping that all she wanted was a better life. A fresh start. My chest tightened thinking about how easily she'd lied to me, about how she'd smiled through every phone call and every dinner. Now I knew the truth. While she was asking me about schools, she was helping Ivory funnel my money into offshore accounts. She'd been my accomplice without a second thought, the daughter I'd raised to be sharp and fearless now turning that blade on me. She didn't even have the decency to call me when the truth came out. No, she messaged me next. You had it coming. You were always too focused on control. That was it. Like my love, my sacrifice, my endless patience meant nothing. Like all those years of late-night stories and birthday parties and emergency calls from the principal's office were just a stepping stone to her real plan. It's funny, in a sick sort of way, how the people you build your life around can so casually twist the knife. She'd always been so quick to call me controlling when I tried to protect her. I guess the line between protection and control was too blurry for her to see the difference. Or maybe she'd just grown too much like her mother. I stared at that message for a long time before responding. Every word that came to mind felt like a wasted breath, like a speech I'd give to an empty room. Instead, I decided to let the facts speak for me. I sent her a photo, one I'd taken from the financial office the day before. Her student loan balances, all canceled. Her passport, flagged and canceled through the embassy's fraud office. The lease she thought she'd found on her own? A lease on a property I owned under a shell company. I'd given her the illusion of independence, because she needed it to feel grown. But now that illusion was gone, and the truth was all that was left. If you want to play this game, I thought, you better be smarter than the man who taught you how to lie. And she wasn't. She'd learned from the best, but she'd underestimated the lesson. Every move she made, I'd already anticipated. Every step she thought was hers, I'd built the path. I sent her the photo with no caption, no explanation, just the facts she tried to hide from. Because in the end, that's what hurt the most. She hadn't even tried to outthink me. She'd just assumed I'd roll over. She'd forgotten who I was. I watched the 3 dots on the screen as she typed her reply, then vanished. No message. No apology. I leaned back in my chair, my chest tight, but my mind calm. Let her sit in that silence. Let her figure out what loyalty really looks like when the game flips. I'd always thought being a father meant protecting her from the world. Now I realized it also meant protecting the world from her. I closed the message thread, the glow of the screen fading, and let the darkness settle in. I was done hoping she'd call me dad again. She'd made her choice. And so had I. While they were busy posing for selfies and living out their fantasy, I was signing closing documents on the real house, our real dream property, the one Ivory had wanted to manifest with my money but had no clue how to secure. A 13,000 square foot smart villa on the coast of Portugal, complete with a private marina, infinity pool, and enough high-tech security to make Fort Knox look like a roadside motel. It was mine now, fully paid, untraceable, and exactly the fortress I needed to build my new life. I'd spent years planning this move, every step documented, every signature forged in the fires of my own ambition. She'd called me controlling, but I called it being prepared. It's funny how people mistake security for suffocation when they're too short-sighted to see the storm clouds gathering. Scott was the first to arrive. My oldest friend and my private legal counsel. He'd been there from the beginning, back when I was just a scrappy security consultant with more guts than sense. We'd met over drinks and mutual enemies, both of us drawn to the idea of being the man in the shadows instead of the one on the stage. Now he walked through the massive oak doors of my new home, his grin splitting his face like he'd just found the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. "So this is your comeback?" he asked, dropping his bag at the entrance and taking in the marble floors and the endless ocean view. I laughed and shook my head. "No," I said, pouring him a drink from the custom bar I'd had installed. "This is my life, finally without leeches." We toasted over dark amber whiskey, the kind of drink that tastes like honesty and burns like the truth. Scott took a long sip, his eyes scanning the open-concept living room, the high ceilings, the carefully curated art. "Damn, Silas. You always were 3 steps ahead." She didn't even see it coming, did she? I leaned against the counter and watched the sun sink lower on the horizon, the waves crashing against the rocky shore. "No," I said quietly. She thought I'd be too focused on rebuilding the marriage to see the cracks in her smile. But I saw them, Scott. I saw them all. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. We'd both known betrayal too well, him with his ex-wife, me with mine. We both learned the hard way that sometimes the people you'd give your last breath to were the ones who'd take it from you without hesitation. That night, the villa was alive with the quiet hum of freedom. No tension, no cold looks, no laughter laced with secrets. Just the sound of the sea and the soft, reassuring hum of security systems I'd designed myself. Scott and I sat on the terrace, the wind carrying the salt air and the distant echoes of a world I'd left behind. I felt a weight lift off my chest, a weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for so long. He glanced at me over the rim of his glass. "So what's the plan now?" he asked. "You going to let her sweat it out? Or are you planning to push her over the edge?" I considered the question for a long moment, letting the sea fill the silence. "She's already over the edge," I said finally. "She just doesn't know it yet." He raised an eyebrow. "You always did like playing the long game." I smirked and looked back at the waves. "That's the only game that matters," I said. "Everything else is just noise." I thought about the message I'd gotten from Ivory that morning, like a last, desperate lifeline cast out into a sea of panic. "The police are asking questions. Did you set us up?" The words made me laugh out loud, the sound sharp and unexpected. I'd expected anger, maybe rage. But all I felt was a cold satisfaction that came from knowing I'd finally forced her to look in the mirror. I'd finally made her see that the world she'd tried to build on lies and stolen dreams was crashing down around her. I pulled out my phone, the glow of the screen reflecting in the glass of the wine Scott had poured. I read her message one last time, then replied with a single thumbs-up emoji. Nothing more. No explanation. No excuses. Let her stew in that silence. Let her guess what it meant. Let her wonder if I was the one behind every bad break that was coming her way. Because the truth was, I didn't need to say a word. I'd already won. I turned off my phone, set it on the table, and leaned back in my chair. The ocean was a constant presence here, its rhythm steady and unbroken. A reminder that life moves on, even when the people you thought you'd share it with choose to betray you. Scott watched me, his eyes a mixture of admiration and caution. "So what now?" he asked. I shrugged, feeling the cool night air settle around me like a blanket. "Now I live," I said simply. "For me. For the man I've always been. The one who doesn't need to look over his shoulder every time he opens his front door." He nodded, raising his glass again. "To living," he said, his voice firm. I clinked my glass against his, the sound sharp and satisfying in the night. "To living," I echoed, the taste of freedom on my tongue. I didn't need to chase Ivory. I didn't need to explain myself to Camille. They'd made their choices, and now they'd have to live with them. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, the ocean stretching out beyond the window like a promise I'd finally kept to myself. I thought about all the times I'd compromised, all the ways I'd bent over backwards to make sure everyone else was happy. I thought about the lies, the half-truths, the empty apologies. And then I thought about the future, the one I was building brick by brick, dollar by dollar, on a foundation of honesty I'd forged in fire. I smiled to myself, feeling lighter than I had in years. This was my life now. Mine. and no one was ever going to take it from me again. Laura sent me the footage the next day like clockwork. She never missed a beat, never let an opportunity slip. I opened the file she'd uploaded to my secure server, and there it was, Ivory's dream trip unraveling one humiliating second at a time. Interpol agents, in their sharp suits and cold eyes, entering the hotel suite with all the quiet menace of professionals who'd seen it all before. Ivory's face, pale and drawn, as they sifted through her designer handbags and custom monogrammed silk ropes. The duffel bag lay on the bed, half unzipped like a wound, revealing those fake bills that had cost me nothing but had taken everything from her. I could almost hear her frantic breath through the screen, the tremble in her voice as she tried to explain that the money was hers, that she didn't know it was counterfeit. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. They thought the fake bills were some kind of test run for laundering, or maybe a bad joke pulled by an amateur. But I'd made sure the UV tags on those notes couldn't be explained away as a prank. The tags were like fingerprints, each one a glowing confession that she'd stolen what wasn't hers. Interpol seized the bag. Customs agents confiscated every piece of luggage. The hotel management, once so eager to cater to her every whim, banned her from the property. I watched the video twice, letting every detail soak in. The way she chewed her lip, the way Camille clutched her mother's arm, eyes wide with fear she'd never admit to feeling. They'd wanted a new life, a fresh start. Instead, they got headlines and interrogation rooms. And their accounts? Frozen. Lara's team had flagged every suspicious transaction, every shady wire transfer, every move Ivory had made to stash my money in offshore accounts. By the time the bank started asking questions, the funds were under scrutiny, marked as potential proceeds from fraud. I'd known every bank manager, every compliance officer by name, some favors earned, some favors called in. When Lara's contact and compliance sent me the screenshots of the frozen accounts, I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about the lesson. The one they'd never forget. Ivory, for all her cunning, didn't know how deep the rabbit hole went. She called her brother, some trust fund kid who'd always thought of me as the guy who'd clipped his wings by marrying his sister. I'd met him once at a family gathering, all smirk and swagger, promising me he'd take care of her if I ever fell short. He'd never lifted a finger to help her in all those years, but now he was her lifeline. I watched her face on the video as she begged him for help, the lines around her eyes tight with desperation. He looked at her the way a man looks at a stranger asking for change on the street, polite, detached, not a single drop of loyalty in his voice. "I can't help you," he'd said. "I told you this would catch up to you." And he hung up. I almost laughed. The irony was too perfect. Then there was Camille. She tried to twist the knife one last time. Messaged one of my biggest clients. A man who'd trusted me with his family's wealth. A man who'd watched me build his empire from the ground up, and told him I was abusive and manipulative. She thought that if she could poison the well, she could cut me off at the knees. But she didn't know that this man had once called me at 3 a.m, terrified his son had been kidnapped, and I'd flown halfway across the world to bring him home. Trust like that isn't broken by a teenager's lies. He sent me the screenshots of her message and asked, "Do you want me to respond?" I stared at his message, feeling that old heat rise in my chest, the one that used to make me want to burn every bridge they'd tried to build. But I took a breath. No. Let her burn the last bridge herself. Let her own that moment. Let her learn that sometimes when you swing a sword, you're the one who bleeds. I watched the sun sink lower in the sky that evening, the colors bleeding together like a painting too vivid to be real. I thought about the years I'd spent making sure they had everything they could possibly want. Every dance class, every birthday party, every designer bag. I thought about how they'd taken every single gift and used it to buy their own destruction. And I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad. I was done. Let them face the consequences. Let them learn that some debts can't be repaid in apologies or tears. Let them finally understand that the man they'd tried to outwit wasn't the fool they'd hoped he'd be. Let them learn, in the end, that the truth always comes for the liars, and it never arrives alone. News of the fake bills spread faster than I'd anticipated, thanks in no small part to Lara's team. It started as a whisper on the finance blogs, just another cautionary tale in a world full of them. Heiress scammed by her own husband's empty fortune. The headline was as brutal as it was precise. They'd blurred Ivory's face in the accompanying photo, but anyone who knew her could recognize the shape of her jaw, the tilt of her chin, the way her designer sunglasses sat perched like a shield. I read the article twice, my lips curled into a half-smile. It wasn't even the content that got me. It was the knowledge that the world finally saw the truth she tried so hard to hide. Every detail was there, neatly arranged in the kind of timeline only an investigator like Laura could piece together. Every lie, every wire transfer, every time she'd smiled at me across the dinner table and called me my love while planning her exit. Ivory's modeling contract was the first to go. I'd seen it coming. The contract had a morals clause tighter than a noose. The agency didn't even bother with a phone call. They sent an email, cold and efficient, terminating the agreement effective immediately. Laura forwarded it to me with a little note. Karma doesn't call ahead. I almost laughed. Camille's acceptance to NYD, her dream school, crumbled next. Turns out, the Fancy Arts Academy didn't look too kindly on applicants whose names were now linked to international fraud investigations. Her admission was revoked before the ink on her acceptance letter had even dried. I pictured her staring at the email, the disbelief on her face as the reality hit. She'd played the game, but she'd never learned the rules. I typed out a final message to them both, my thumb steady on the screen. You didn't just steal money. You stole time, trust, blood, and in the end, all you gained was debt and disgrace. I paused, reading the words, letting their weight settle into my bones. Then I pressed send. There'd be no apology, no explanation. Just the facts, cold and unvarnished, the way I'd always lived my life. I blocked them both, the finality of it like the click of a lock. They'd had their chance. They'd made their choice. Now they could live with it. I sat on the deck that night, the waves crashing against the rocks below like a reminder that the world doesn't stop for anyone's pain. I thought about all the nights I'd sat in boardrooms, negotiating deals that would build our future. I thought about the mornings I'd woken up early to cook breakfast for Camille, even on the days I'd flown in from a red-eye, with nothing left but fumes in my veins. I thought about Ivory's laughter, how I'd once believed it was the soundtrack to my success. How naive I'd been. The truth was, I'd been building our future alone for years, and they'd just been passengers in a car they'd never learned to drive. Laura called me just after sunset, her voice sharp and bright in my ear. Congratulations, she said. They're both officially persona non grata. Every account is flagged. Every contact is ghosting them. The agencies are all calling me, asking if they should cooperate with the investigation. I leaned back, staring at the ocean, the wind cool on my face. Let them, I said. Let every bridge they thought they'd built turn to ash. She was quiet for a moment. Silas, this was never just about the money, was it? I closed my eyes, let the moment stretch. No, I said finally. It was about the principle, about showing them that trust isn't free, that you can't build a new life on the ashes of the one you burned. She sighed, the sound more relief than regret. Well, boss, you did it. You taught them that lesson. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. No, Laura, I said. Life taught them. I just gave it the stage. After the call ended, I walked through the villa, the house silent but for the sound of the ocean. I paused in front of the glass doors that overlooked the patio, my reflection caught between the darkness outside and the warm light inside. I studied myself the way I'd studied her, every line, every scar, every piece of the man I'd become. I wasn't the same man she'd left. I was harder, smarter, less willing to compromise. The man who had once believed that love was a shield was gone. In his place was a man who knew that love, like trust, could be broken and sold to the highest bidder. But even in that knowledge, I felt no regret, because I'd finally learned the most important lesson of all, that you can rebuild what others tried to destroy, if you're willing to let go of the ones who destroyed it. I poured myself a drink and raised it to the night, the liquid catching the last glow of the sunset like a promise. To freedom, I whispered. To the freedom that comes when you finally see the truth for what it is, when you realize that the chains that bound you were ones you let them forge. I let the wind carry the words away, the ocean crashing in agreement. I'd given them enough chances, enough love, enough of my life. Now it was time to give myself what they never could, peace. And as the stars came out one by one, I knew one thing for certain, no amount of stolen money or fake dreams could ever buy that. And they would never find it, not in 1,000 lifetimes. But me? I'd found it at last, and I wasn't giving it back. Back at my villa, I stood barefoot in my private garden, the grass cool and damp beneath my feet, the scent of salt air mingling with the heady fragrance of night-blooming jasmine. The ocean stretched out before me like a vast, dark secret, the waves folding and unfolding in a rhythm older than any betrayal. I closed my eyes and listened to it, steady, relentless, honest in its own way. A reminder that even when the world above is full of lies and broken promises, the tide keeps coming in, the moon keeps rising. It felt right, somehow, that the sea would be the witness to this final chapter of my story. Scott handed me a glass of wine, a deep, rich red that tasted like victory and finality. He'd been a steady presence these past weeks, offering his counsel, his dry wit, his unwavering loyalty. He'd seen me at my worst, and now he was here for my best. He raised his glass, his eyes meeting mine with that familiar spark of mischief. "Any regrets?" he asked. I took a slow sip, letting the wine coat my tongue, the flavors lingering like old memories. "Only one," I said finally, "that I didn't change the locks on my heart years ago." He laughed, a low, knowing sound that felt like an exhale of the tension that had been gripping my chest for months. "Better late than never," he said. I nodded, the truth of it sinking in. Laura had sent her final update that morning. Both mother and daughter were under investigation for financial fraud, attempted use of counterfeit instruments, and a laundry list of lesser crimes that read like the script of a cautionary tale. The authorities had frozen what was left of their assets, and the agencies that had once bent over backward to cater to their whims were now holding them at arm's length, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. I'd read the report over coffee, a quiet satisfaction settling over me like a well-worn coat. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about the principle, about making sure the game they'd tried to play ended with the same dignity they'd stolen from me. Scott raised his glass again, a mock salute. "Here's to karma," he said, showing up fashionably late but armed to the teeth. I chuckled, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. "And with witnesses," I added. "Never forget the witnesses." He grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Always the strategist," he said. "You could have made a fortune in poker." I shrugged, my gaze drifting back to the ocean. "Poker's too easy," I said. "Everyone's bluffing. I like a game where the stakes are real." He shook his head, that knowing grin still in place. "Well, my friend, you've certainly played your cards right this time." I let his words settle, the truth of them resonating deep inside me. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without wondering when the next betrayal would come. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't holding my breath for an apology that would never arrive. I was here, in the present, on my own terms. And that felt like the greatest victory of all. The night air was cool against my skin as I leaned back in my chair, the stars overhead bright and unblinking. I thought about Camille, my daughter, my blood, the little girl who'd once crawled into my lap with her hair still damp from the bath, who'd looked up at me with wide eyes and told me I was her hero. I wondered if she'd ever understand what she'd done, if she'd ever look back on these days and see the fork in the road where she'd chosen lies over loyalty. I doubted it. But that was her burden to bear now, not mine. I'd given her everything I could, and she'd used it to build a wall between us. Let her live with that choice. Scott tapped his glass against mine, drawing my attention back to the moment. "So what's next for Silas Mercer?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. I took a long breath, feeling the weight of the past slide off my shoulders like a discarded coat. "Now," I said, "I build a life worth living, one that's mine alone." He nodded, his expression softening. "No more looking over your shoulder?" I shook my head. "No more waiting for the next betrayal," I said. "No more sharing my home with ghosts." We sat there in comfortable silence, the waves our only soundtrack. I felt the last threads of the life I'd left behind fray and break, each one freeing me from the ties that had bound me to people who'd never deserved my trust. I wasn't the same man I'd been when Ivory and Camille walked out that door. I was stronger, wiser, and finally, at peace. I lifted my glass one last time, the stars reflecting in the deep red of the wine. "To freedom," I said, my voice steady. Scott raised his glass in response. "To freedom," he echoed. We drank in unison, the taste of victory and peace mingling on our tongues. As the night stretched out before us, I knew one thing for certain: I would never let anyone hold the keys to my happiness again. This villa, this life, this peace, it was mine, and no one would ever take it from me. Not Ivory, not Camille, not the ghosts of the past. They'd had their chance. They'd made their choices. Now it was my turn to live, and to live without regret. No headlines. No revenge posts. No confrontation. Just peace. A new life. That's what I'd built here, brick by brick, in a place where the world felt wide open and the horizon stretched out like a promise. After everything, After the betrayal, the lies, the web of deceit woven by the two people I'd once loved most, peace wasn't just a luxury, it was my redemption. I'd spent too many years defining myself by the money, the deals, the responsibilities that came with being the provider, the protector. I'd given them everything, a house, security, every advantage money could buy, and in the end, they'd taken the one thing I'd never realized was mine to protect, my dignity. But now, standing on the balcony of my villa overlooking the ocean, I felt like I'd finally reclaimed it. I'd bought a Steinway, a piano that gleamed like a secret in the corner of the living room. My fingers had been itching to play since the day it arrived. Music had been a luxury I'd given up during the years I was too busy working late nights to pay for their dreams. Now, I let the keys sing for me, their notes filling the villa like a breath of fresh air. I played for no one but myself. Some nights I'd lose myself in those chords, letting the music carry me back to a time when I believed love was enough. But as the notes settled into the quiet, I realized that love wasn't enough if it wasn't returned. You can't build a life with someone who only sees you as a means to an end. Painting came next. I hadn't held a brush since college, before Ivory, before the boardrooms, and the relentless climb to the top. I started small, just sketches at first. Then the lines turned into colors, the colors turned into shapes, and before I knew it, my hands were steady, and my mind was quiet. Art didn't ask questions. It didn't lie. It let me pour every raw, unspoken word into the canvas, letting the truth bleed out in hues of red and blue and black. I hung the paintings in my study, each one a testament to the lessons I'd learned, the pain I'd survived. They reminded me that I could still create something honest in a world that had tried to convince me otherwise. I started mentoring young entrepreneurs, kids who'd grown up like me, scrappy, ambitious, underestimated. I taught them everything I knew: how to read people, how to build trust that couldn't be bought or sold, how to build a fortress around their dreams without letting it turn into a prison. I saw pieces of myself in their wide eyes, their eager questions. I warned them that betrayal always comes from the place you least expect it, that love can be a weapon in the hands of the wrong person. But I also taught them that every setback is a lesson, every loss a chance to rebuild stronger than before. It felt good to give back, to take all the pain and turn it into something that might save someone else from making my mistakes. One evening, while the sun dipped into the ocean like a gold coin slipping into a well, Scott joined me on the balcony. He'd been in town for a conference, but he made time to see me. "You're different," he said, studying me like I was one of my own paintings. "Happier." I nodded, swirling the wine in my glass. "I'm free," I said simply. He leaned against the railing, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Freedom looks good on you," he said. I smiled back, the ocean breeze cool against my skin. "Thanks," I replied. "It feels good." That's when I got the letter. Scott had picked it up from the mailbox on his way in. It was forwarded by my lawyer, one of those little details I'd let Laura arrange to make sure nothing from the past found its way here unfiltered. The envelope was neat, cream-colored, expensive. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Camille. My chest tightened as I turned it over in my hands, memories flickering like ghosts. Her first day of school, the way she'd once run to me when she scraped her knee, the sound of her laughter in the old house before it became just another place full of secrets. Scott watched me, his eyes cautious. "You don't have to open it," he said. I nodded, the paper suddenly heavy. "I know," I said, "but I did." I slit the envelope and pulled out the letter. No apology. No remorse. Just a request for money. A number scrawled in the margin, the same entitled tone I'd seen in her messages to my clients. Like I owed her something just because we shared blood. I felt a tightness in my chest, but it wasn't pain. It was clarity. I took the letter and walked to the fireplace in my study, the one place I'd kept as a sanctuary from the rest of the world. I tossed it in, watched the flames catch the edge and devour the words until they were nothing but ash. Scott stood behind me, silent, waiting. I turned to him, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "You see," I said, my voice steady, "they thought money was the goal. But I finally learned, real wealth is freedom. And I'm not sharing it again." He smiled, that rare, proud smile that always reminded me why he'd been the one I'd trusted with my truth. "I think you finally found the only currency that matters," he said. I nodded, feeling lighter than I had in years. "Yeah," I said, "freedom. And no one can steal that from me." As the fire burned low, I walked out onto the balcony, the stars winking overhead like promises. I felt the night wrap around me, The sea's steady rhythm that reminded me that some things can't be bought or broken. I raised my glass to the horizon, a silent toast to the man I'd become, the man who'd survived the worst and come out stronger. And in that moment, I knew that I'd never be theirs to betray again. My life was my own. My freedom was the truest wealth I'd ever known. And that, finally, was enough.